Welcome to a very special series on the St. Luke's podcast that is all about deconstructing faith. We're your hosts, Jon Jones and Mindie Moore, and we've been through the process of deconstructing and building back faith, and we love to talk about it with you. This is a 6-part series where we can go deeper into some of the elements that make deconstruction difficult, but also so very worth it. Whether you're at the beginning of your deconstruction journey or you've been doing this work for decades, we're glad you're here. Well, last episode, we talked about how we relate to our families of origin when we deconstruct, the places that we've come from, especially if they haven't been on that same journey. Yeah. But today, we're looking at it slightly differently. We're looking into the future. I don't know. That's the only time I'm going to sing in this entire podcast.
Did you practice that ahead of time?
I didn't. It was totally improv. How about that? But we are going to look at how we parent either after or during deconstruction. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what I want to say before we have this conversation. We are both parents. We're going to talk about that in detail. But if you are not a parent, I hope that you'll stick around for this conversation because I don't think that what we're going to talk about is purely for parents. I think if you have any kids in your life, even just as we think about like how we process and care for ourselves, I think we'll hit on some stuff that will matter, whether you are on a parenting journey
100%
or not.
Yeah.
And so as we start today, Jon, I thought it would be helpful if we kind of laid out what are our parenting lives like? Like, how many kids do you have? How old are they? What are your greatest fears? Easy things like that.
I've got 2 little girls who are 10 and 7, and they're absolutely incredible. Love them to death. What is my greatest fear other than rats or just generally rodents, which seems so lame to say that out loud.
Very
so lame. But really, truly, I am deathly afraid of rodents.
Well, they can be like as big as puppies.
Don't talk about that. That makes me more scared. Oh my gosh. Other than that, let's get off of rats so I don't just pass out here. But my greatest fear is that my daughters would be turned off from faith because of religious guilt or just shame-based faith kind of stuff. I grew up with a lot of that. And in some ways, I think it's a wonder that I'm still following God a lot of times or still in a spiritual kind of pathway. And so my greatest fear for them, I guess, is just that because I'm in ministry and because I'm around church a lot, that they would see it as something that they have to do, not something that they want to do or get to do or choose to do with their own life. And it just makes me sad to see when people walk away because of that, where they were never given the option, of being able to decide whether it was something that was for them or not. And so, that was really vulnerable for me to say that out loud.
Yeah.
That was weird.
I'm glad we just started with a really hard
question. I know. Holy cow.
Yeah. But I really get it. I do. So I have a daughter and a son. My daughter is 11. My son is 7.
Yeah.
And I think for me, as I was thinking about going into ministry, which happened before we had children.
Sure.
But I always kind of thought in the back of my head, I really don't want to have those pastors' kids who hate church, who feel like they have to be a certain way at church, or like their faith has to look a certain way, or like people have these expectations for them.
Yeah, because you don't want people to look at them as being different because there are kids. But I do think there's something to be said for that difference between kind of guiding and leading, right? There's that constant battle of like, how am I leading my kid to grow up, and what things do I want to hand off to them, and at what point do I guide versus lead? I don't just pull them along with me. I actually say, hey, this is your journey to go on now.
Yeah. And it's kind of wild if I think about like the things that I talk to my kids about with faith and like the things I don't talk to them. So I would tell you that growing up, probably, I think this is really true, but it kind of blows my mind what I'm about to say. I think by like kindergarten, first grade, I had a pretty strong articulation about like what hell is. And like could tell you, like that's where you go.
Definitely afraid of it.
Yeah, very afraid, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I just don't, like, my kids know what that concept is, but that is nowhere in their vocabulary about like how they relate to God, or like, I don't think it's like a fear.
Yeah,
that they
fear-based
have.
kind of God relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I think the era that we grew up in had a lot of that attached to it. And, maybe some of you guys out there have experienced it as well, where it was follow God because you don't want divine wrath, basically.
Right.
And I think for you and I, we've emerged out of that and had chosen a faith path that's not attached to guilt and not attached to shame. But I think the harsh reality is that it's really easy to teach a person that way. And it's really hard to teach a person to choose it because it's a pathway toward faith and love and your soul development and toward an intimate relationship with the divine and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, and I think too, like as you were talking, I think sometimes we have to almost avoid those reflexes.
Yes.
So I think, we both have daughters, so
Yeah.
maybe you have experienced this too, but like the modesty thing, I don't know if that, like, we haven't talked about purity culture really on this. Oh, do we need a bonus episode?
Maybe we need one.
Okay, we're planning this in
Holy
real time,
cow.
friends.
That'd be a good one.
It's so important. But so I grew up with like the whole purity
Modest is
culture.
hottest.
Modest is hottest. Ew. Like, no, not good. And so like that's what we would talk about. And now I have a tween daughter, and for some reason, crop tops are a thing again. I pray about it every day, not because of modesty, just because I'm afraid of it. But
just
like,
fashion mistakes,
it's a thing. But so I like see her, and she'll say, "Can I wear this to church, or can I wear this out of the house?" And it's like, oh, there's this weird sort of reflexive thing that I have to like unlearn.
Yeah.
And I think we do a lot of unlearning.
A lot of unlearning.
And it's also happening in real time
as
we shape, young lives. So no pressure.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not even so much the purity culture stuff, because I just despise it so much that I've kind of ripped it out of my vocabulary. I think for me, I grew up in a very strict like media home where it was like what I could watch and couldn't watch and that kind of stuff. And so for me, I don't ever like restrict stuff for my daughters because I just kind of want to be able to watch it with them and have the conversations and help them. But I get this like twinge of guilt inside of myself to be like, am I a horrible parent because I'm letting my daughters watch like a PG-13 movie with me or something like that,
Yeah.
And I know that sounds absolutely crazy and stupid, but simultaneously there's something where we're handed down a guilt complex from our parents and then from our grandparents, great-grandparents. And I come out of a family that had tons. It was like an industrial shame complex, right? Just producing it like nonstop. And so for me, I think a big part of this is like, how do we break generational levels of shame and generational levels of kind of guilt? And how do you kind of stop that kind of train from rolling down the tracks and finally begin to create healthy human beings who come past us?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like, you are deconstructing your own faith.
Yeah.
You're trying to figure that out, but then you're also handing it to this next generation. And, someday they're going to tell their stories about us. I mean, we always joke about that in our home. We're like, what is the thing that our kids are going to be like, wow, my parents did this, and it was really something.
Totally. They're going to have their thing that they hate.
Yeah.
And they're going to think we're super lame and like all that kind of stuff. I mean, probably not me. They're probably going to think I'm awesome the entire time.
No, they're definitely. They're going to be like, my mother never missed a teachable moment.
Right.
And it was just so much. So much.
It's like the things you hand down, I really, really hope that I don't hand down toxic church and toxic faith to my kids. Yeah. And I said that was my fear, but it's also my greatest hope in some ways. My greatest fear and greatest hope are probably two sides of the same coin, that somehow by the way that I live my life and by the way that I try to raise my daughters and the journey of searching and curiosity that I take them on, that somehow that toxicity will break and I give them a holistically healthy understanding of church.
Yeah. Do you have have you guys had a moment where you've kind of had that moment for curiosity and an opportunity to just ask questions or?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just come up kind of naturally as, time has gone on. My kids have asked a lot about So going through school, they learn a lot of science kind of stuff. And so they want to know my daughter came home and she's like, Dad, I was reading my Bible, and they've got, little kids' Bibles that are, the kind of cartoony version ones or whatever that I love them, but they're not the full spectrum kind of thing.
They're not reading like the original Hebrew.
No.
Your children don't do that.
No, my kids are the unschooled ones. But she came home and she said, Dad, we were learning about how the universe was created and about how, human beings evolved and all this kind of stuff. She's like, but I was reading my Bible and I don't know. I don't know how to do these two things. And when I was growing up, it was 100% it's a 7-day creation. That's what the Bible says. And, the dinosaur bones were just put there by God for fun so that we could find something cool to do. And it was so freeing for me and so beautiful for me to be able to look at them and say, hey, you know what? The science in the Bible will never contradict. They just wrote it based in their time period with the knowledge that they have. And we have a lot more knowledge now. And what you're learning in your science class is totally truthful and totally accurate and totally it's in line with honoring God. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And so that, I think, is one of the first ways that I noticed it for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I can think of like lessons in youth group and, friends even like up to high school who would say, oh, I'm protesting this teaching of evolution. I'm not going to do this work. And it's just such a different way, I think, to like give our kids a foundation for, you don't have to have that conflict. You don't have to have that dichotomy. You can be curious and you can ask questions.
Yes.
And you can like participate in the communities that you're in.
Yeah, and that it's safe to engage with information outside of our home. I think I want to be careful, and I've been really careful to teach my daughters that I'm not an expert on everything. On music, obviously, I'm an expert. Only listen to the bands I want. In terms of sports and stuff like that, I'm an expert. Only like my teams, all that. But outside of those, I'm not an expert in all things. And it's okay for you to find resources and experts outside of myself. And we don't have to be afraid of new information and don't have to be afraid of new knowledge. And so in some ways, I'm almost doing deconstruction with them without knowing that they don't know they're deconstructing from anything because they don't have anything to deconstruct from, but we're ripping apart the old ways of thinking that could have harmed them. So it's almost busting through walls in front of them, trying to get a path clear, I guess.
Yeah, like the Kool-Aid man.
Yeah, like the Kool-Aid man. Yeah, I'm basically like a faith Kool-Aid man, just running through walls in front of my daughters, deconstructing.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I was going to say, what you made me think about is, so one of my favorite resources for parents, for churches, is the Fuller Youth Institute's work.
Oh, yes.
And one of like the OG Fuller Institute Youth Institute things was called Sticky Faith.
Yeah, Kara
And
Powell.
So good, so wise, amazing. But my favorite thing they talk about in there is kind of like, I'm not going to say it perfectly right. So read the book, you can still get it. But it's kind of that rule of 5. So they talk about how one of the biggest indicators for kids for their faith sticking past high school into adulthood, it was not that they had all the answers. It was not that they had it all figured out. It was not that someone said, do all these things this certain way.
Yes.
It was that they had 5 adults investing in them that were outside of their immediate family.
Yeah.
And when you were saying, like, I don't have to be the expert, I think about that, like, with my own kids and what a gift it is that they have adults in the church who, like, love them and know them and show up to their events and, that they know that they're safe to talk with. And, they're young enough. So it's mostly just like, let me tell you about Sephora if you're Hazel, or let me tell you about soccer if you're my son, Reese. Yeah. But someday it won't be those things. Someday it'll be like, hey, I'm seeing this thing that doesn't make sense. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
And their mom's a pastor. So like they could ask me, but I hope they don't only ask me.
Yeah. And I think what you're pointing toward is the idea that we don't have to hand them certainty. That in the past, it felt like what my parents are trying to do is get me locked down into faith before I got to adulthood, because that way maybe I won't stray someday and walk away. And instead, I think what I'm trying to do with my daughters is teach them, how do you ask the right question, and how do you be comfortable with uncomfortable things like not knowing what something is, or how do you get to the point of being able to say, I just don't know. For me, we both did youth ministry at a certain point in time.
Yes.
And if you're a youth pastor that happens to be listening to us, blessings on you.
We
Grace
love
and
you.
peace.
We love you. We're so deeply grateful.
Yeah, really, seriously, we are. But for me, I started in youth ministry trying to have an answer for everything and trying to answer everything with the most perfect, like theological Jesus juke type answer where like it all came back around and here's how you answer this and how you answer questions from other people and stuff like that. And what I ended up realizing was that my students were more concerned about authenticity and more about vulnerability with faith and more with a willingness to say it's okay to not know the answers. And that was what moved them closer to God than any amount of rock solid arguments I could give them.
Yeah.
And did you ever see that? I mean, like, what did you see when you were trying to work with kids?
Yeah, so I worked with a few different youth groups, but I think two really stood out for kind of lessons that I learned. So my church previous to St. Luke's, I came in there and I was very much still in there's a whole term for it. I'm not finding it, but just behavior, basically. Like
behavioral modification.
Yes, that idea that like, look, you're going to learn about Jesus, you're going to do the right things, you're going to behave, and you're not going to
take drugs, you're not going to drink, and not going to go with girls who do.
Yes, exactly. So it was like very much that mindset. Where that started to fall apart was when you'd run into like the real life of these students. Yeah. And you'd realize like, wait, maybe there's a gray area. Maybe there's trauma we haven't unpacked. Maybe like it's just a moment in their lives and it doesn't mean they're like on the highway to hell.
Right.
Like there's some grace and some just, room for these journeys. And so that was kind of like the first sort of learning. Yeah. So then when I came here to St. Luke's, I was like, oh, well, I've got to like dispel all of this stuff. And so I will never forget, it was like one of my first, youth sermons that I did on a Sunday morning. And I'm talking to this room.
Youth sermons, I love youth
sermons. And I just wanted to be like so cool. I'm just not. So I'm embracing that part of myself now. But like, I was talking to them and I don't even remember what the topic was, but I remember being like, you think this, but really, blah, blah. And it was like, boom, boom, this can be so punchy. And no one cared. And I'm like, wait, this was supposed to like floor you. You're
this is how Jesus did it. This is like the sermon I'm giving my own Sermon on the Mount. Come on.
And what I realized with these students at this church in this context is that like, they didn't have the same baggage that I had.
No, they don't.
And like, thank goodness, I was so grateful. But also it was like, whew, I got to like teach totally differently. I have to approach this differently because they're going to heal from certain things. But like the things that I had to heal from, the things I had to unpack, they're not steeping in that here.
Right. Well, it's bringing it back into the parenting realm, it's going to be the same for our kids, right? That what they'll need to eventually probably do some bits of deconstruction from are not going to be kind of the things that you and I grew up with. And their questions that will rock them are likely not the same questions that rocked us.
Yeah. But those will rock us when they ask them, right?
Yeah.
We'll be like, whoa, 100%. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting real now.
Yeah.
But, I do think that I also don't want to just give them nothing in terms of faith because faith is so important to me, and following God, which is such a churchy type of phrase and word to use, but trying to be on this kind of relationship with God type of pathway and trying to make my life look more like Jesus every day is so important to me that I want my daughters to value it somehow, some way, shape, or form. And so I don't want to hand off nothing, but that means we have to reclaim something off of our journey because somehow we got to here. We can dog on our parents all we want, but the reality is that they did get us to this point.
Absolutely.
So when you are looking at your kids and your family, what are you kind of reclaiming? What are you holding on to that you think is going to be instrumental for them in terms of their faith journey?
Well, okay, this seems like the most obvious place we can start because you're a pastor. You go to church, you go to work on Sunday mornings. But really and truly being part of a faith community, it's just huge.
Transformational.
And it has actually maybe surprised me how huge it is for my kids. Like they have have to go. That sounds bad, but like they kind of do have to go. And yet they want to go.
Right.
So I took the Sunday off this past Sunday. We had been on vacation. We were, getting ready to go back to real life. And our kids were like, why aren't we going to church? And I was like, well, I'm off today. And they're like, but we won't see our friends. We won't see our people. And I mean, they love being in that place.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it's like, wow, this being in community and practicing our faith, like, because we can read the Bible, we can pray together. I mean, we do those things, but there is something special about doing it in a communal way. And I do think that's a value that we're handing down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think for me, one of the big things has been kind of prayer and kind of the whole mystery of it, but simultaneously just teaching them to pray in just normal everyday words. Because our part is like, you and I both know that when we stand on a stage, and I'm sure if you've ever been on a Sunday morning to a church, you hear the pastor pray and you're like, wow, that was such a flowery, beautiful prayer. And yes, we probably thought it out ahead of time or wrote it down ahead of time or planned it somehow to work into the sermon or whatever. And I think the reality is I want them to be able to hear me stumble over words and to not know what to pray about sometimes and to ask them to pray, at different points. And I think trying to give them a value for that even if you don't always know what it's doing, even if you don't always know the right words to say, that somehow I'm trusting God really is listening and really does care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one of the funniest things, I mean, it's funny to me. Hopefully this isn't offensive to anyone listening, but like one of the things that I have like set down in my deconstruction is mealtime prayer.
Ooh, really?
I know. It freaks people out sometimes. So I grew up Lutheran. We had a prayer that we said at every meal. You recite it.
Yeah.
It just became kind of like a weird vibe for me as I got older. It's like, I'm not going to pray at mealtimes. I pray a lot. This is not the venue that I like make my family pray.
Yeah.
Well, we had some family visit and who does pray. And they said, would you like to say the prayer? Yo, my kids did not know the prayer. And I was like, oh no, this is like
family fail.
This is a bad moment. And so they didn't know the prayer. I think we got judged. I mean, my kids love Jesus. They just don't know the prayer.
Do they though? They don't know the prayer.
They don't know the prayer. I know, it's bad. But so it was like a funny moment of, okay, this is where a change has happened. And these weren't family members that we see them maybe once a year. Like they're not regularly in our lives or anything, but it just was this stark difference of tradition and value. And we have similar values. We just express them differently.
Yeah. I think I have had the same qualms with dinner prayer time. Mea culpa, we still do a family kind of prayer at dinner time. And I think in some ways I've come to value it differently now, where I'm kind of like, you know what, it just is a good moment where I stop and I'm like, yeah, God, thanks for, providing for us. But I do have that same issue where I'm kind of like, am I teaching my kids to pray kind of just a rote, say the same thing every time kind of prayer, that they are now learning that prayer is meaningless? Mm-hmm. So I have that same fear. But, then in some ways it's the same with scripture. Like I don't force them to read the Bible at all. I was forced to read the Bible.
Oh, we had to memorize it. I was going to say memorize in front of my class.
And what really, you want the ultimate tension inside of me? I really worry that my kids aren't memorizing the Bible, because my being able to recall Bibles type stuff on a regular basis is directly because of being forced to as a kid. And I value it so heavily now because I've got it kind of just inside of me and I just know it. But the flip side is I fear that if I do that to my children, I give them shame and guilt, and that maybe they don't find the value in it someday, and it ends up being destructive to their faith practice. Yeah. And so I have this crazy tension inside of me where it's like, yeah, if you want to read the Bible, I want to read it with you, and let's, figure it out together and do this whole thing. But I'm not going to force you into it at all. And that's what I do on a day in, day out basis is read it, Yeah. But it's scary.
Yeah,
it's scary to set stuff down like that.
Well, I'll tell you, as someone who went to Lutheran school and had to stand up in front of the class and recite scripture, I have a mental block on being able to memorize scripture.
Really? Yes. We can do a whole episode.
But I love the Bible. I love the Bible, so it's fine. Basically, they're going to turn out all right, John.
Yeah, I hope so. Right. I hope so.
Yeah.
So, all right. for parents that are going through deconstruction or have deconstructed already, and it's just kind of a part of their life now, they got kids, they're in the same process as us, what kind of like resources do you have or would you offer up in terms of like, hey, this would be helpful for guiding with your kids, like that kind of stuff? Do you have ones that you would do?
Yeah. So I actually did, I brought a list because I do like a list. But before I share some of the things on my list, I do want to say maybe the biggest piece of, I don't know, wisdom feels weird. We were talking before this, like we are not experts.
No,
we are in this. And so we're learning. I'm sure we're making a million mistakes. Like we're just living our lives, right?
Yeah.
Trying to be faithful, trying to love our kids the 100%. Best we can. But I think the biggest thing that I try to live by is that I don't have to have an answer to every single question my kids ask. And it makes me think of like what you're talking about with your daughter and science and the Bible.
Yeah.
But I mean, my kids, especially my son, like he just wants to know the things.
Yeah.
And the other day he was asking me right before bed, very light conversation, Mom, where do we go when we die? I was like, cool, let's talk about this before we go to sleep.
How'd you answer that one?
Well, I said, well, we believe that God takes care of us. We believe that like God never stops loving us. And even when we die, we know that God is always with us. And oftentimes we talk about that as this place called heaven. And so that's what we can think of. It's a place where God is close to us and we experience God's love forever.
It's up in the sky and you sit on clouds and you've got a harp. And,
yes, that is what I was taught.
Totally.
And so I tried not to use that imagery.
That's good.
But then his response to me, and this is what just made me laugh so hard, is he said, Mom, why don't we just Google it? And I was like, bro, we could, but like.
That's so great.
I know, it's so great. But it's like, I get it. It's that quest for like, just tell me all the things. And so often I tell my kids, we have ideas, we have faith, we have hope. We don't have tons of certainty.
Yeah. And, I think inside of that too is just the idea of intentionality versus passivity.
Yes.
Is like, are you choosing to be intentional with your family, with your kids, with your life and with your faith practice? Or are you just sitting by and being like, hey, I hope if I take my kids to church for, a couple of years that they catch a spiritual bug and, it kind of rolls with them for their life or whatever. And so, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have certainty. It's okay for you to kind of just set down the need of that. Mm-hmm. But maybe, just maybe, being intentional makes all the difference.
Yeah.
So, all right, you got a list.
I have a list. I know. And I'm doing some Googling even while we talk. Because why not? I love it. So I do love a good kids Bible.
Yep.
Story Bibles. Yep. I do not love some of them, which we're not going to go there.
We won't name names.
I'm not here for that.
I agree.
But I'm going to tell you a couple that are great resources. So Growing in God's Love, a story Bible is so one of them. It is so good. I love the diverse representation in it. Yep. I love the way that they talk about God. I love how there's like a mix of poetry and story.
It's beautiful.
100%. So good. There's also a brand new resource called the Book of Belonging, which I've not got my hands on yet. I have stalked it on Instagram, which feels like, a good start. Yeah. But it's supposed to be just another beautiful way to talk about, who God is and how these stories relate to us. My favorite book, it makes me cry every time. My kids Hazel is like, you cry every time you read this children's book. It is true. But it's called What is God Like?
Oh, that one is
do you love it?
Gut punch. I love it so much. Yes.
It's so good.
It's so beautiful.
So Rachel Held Evans started it. Yep. Matthew Paul Turner finished it.
Yep.
I just think I don't even care if you have kids. I just want every adult to read that book because I read that book and I think this is what I wish I had been taught about God.
This is kind of the heart of faith right here.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. So that's a home run. I think basically anything by Matthew Paul Turner is
all his kids stuff
wonderful.
Is fantastic.
I just love it. And then Meredith Ann Miller is a great resource, not for kids, but for parents.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then there's a couple accounts, Deconstructing Mamas. You don't have to be a mom. It's really for anyone. And then Parenting After Deconstruction that have some good practical
resourcing,
things like that.
Ideas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if you're intentional about your parenting and intentional about kind of how you want to be inclusive of faith inside of your kid's life, any of those would be a great start.
Yeah. I wonder, as we get ready to wrap up today, if you and I have any just closing maybe encouragement for people who are trying to parent as they deconstruct after they deconstruct.
I think my biggest encouragement would be that if you are intentional, that you don't have to worry about getting it wrong, that it's okay to get it wrong and it's okay to mess it up. And if you're trying, that I think God could actually work through your trying, and that God could fill in any gap in anything that you're doing. And that if God is who we think God is, if the Spirit is what we think it is it possible that you can totally mess it up? But if you're trying, that maybe that God could be working inside your kid's life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think what I'd add, since this is a Methodist podcast, is that, my favorite, in all honesty, my favorite thing about being Methodist, the reason that I was like, ooh, I'm home when I, got to this place, when I started ordination, is because of our theology of grace.
Yeah.
And I just think I say this all the time to people, we are grace-shaped people.
Yep.
And so grace goes before you, it's right next to you, it's behind you, it's in places you can't even imagine to look for it. And so just let yourself exhale the stress and the shame and the I'm not good enough, I don't know what I'm doing. And inhale back God's grace.
Yeah, His love.
Yeah. And just remember that God is at work in spite of us and because of us and just is.
And I sit there wondering, is He just absolutely amused and happy that we're trying?
Yeah.
And, if God is what we think God is, then I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, we're glad that you're with us today as we talked about parenting and deconstruction. I feel like we could do a whole podcast on all of the things about parenting, but this is a piece of it. And so remember, grace goes with you, God's love is with you, and you are doing okay. So we'll see you next time.